So, as you just heard, I'm trained as an ancient historian, but the last couple of years I've really kind of got obsessed in the family history. And it's been a really rather an interesting one, because the family records, like my grandfather died when I was 16 years old, so in theory I could have asked him a bunch of questions and all sorts of things, which I never did. And he was one of those men, you know, who never talked about the war. So we had a very unreliable memoir written by one of my uncles, who I found all sorts of problems with it. But virtually everything about my grandfather, therefore, has been a research project trying to reconstruct events. For example, one of the things I'm going to tell you about is when he got a traumatic shoulder wound in 1916. None of the family had the faintest clue he'd ever been wounded in the shoulder. That just came out of his military records. So some of it comes from family history, but most of it has been a research project going to the archives, going to official histories, going to all sorts of other things. So we have a few family photos, like that's the nicest one we have of him, from probably 1916 or 1917, based on the unit badge that he has on his collar and the rank. But I'll just take you through briefly the story of this man and what he experienced through World War I.
You do look like him.
Yeah, people say there's been a strong family resemblance coming down that side. In fact, we have an ancestral village in Scotland. It's called Buckie. Like, if you're going to have an ancestral village, you wish it had a better name than Buckie. I've never been there, but it's, from all accounts, it's a rain-swept, bleak fishing village on the North Sea coast. But one of my cousins, who also has similar features, I should say, like, well, Fowler is obviously my mother's maiden name, and one of my cousins went there, and he went into a local pub, and one of the guys at the local pub looked at him and said, "You're a Fowler." So there's clearly something about these features that has run strong through that Scottish line. Okay, so, and well, again, you see the Scottish tradition. So my grandfather actually starts off, even before World War I starts out, with a really interesting backstory. So his father, that would be my great-grandfather, immigrated to New Zealand, went down to Dunedin, which is sort of Scotland in the south, and he met a colonial girl and got married, had 3 children, and my grandfather was the third of them. When my grandfather was not yet 1 year old, about 11 months old, his mother died. So that's his mother. She died when she was 28 years old. And I actually found, my father passed away earlier this year, and when I was back for the funeral, one of my cousins brought a big metal box of family documents, and in this I found these in memoriam cards that were issued by the funeral director, and this is the actual little cards that were given for my great-grandmother's funeral. And so my great-grandfather decided basically to give up on the whole New Zealand experiment, the whole New Zealand adventure. And so he took the 3 kids back to London. So when my grandfather might have been born in New Zealand, but he actually grew up from about age 2 in London. So he witnessed Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee, all sorts of things. Baden-Powell, famous for founding the Boy Scout movement, came and talked at the school where he talked. He actually had Marconi, famous for inventing the radio, actually stay at his house in London, because they were sort of a bit of a guest house for visitors, all sorts of interesting things there. And for reasons that have never really been apparent, as soon as he turned 18, he decided he was going back to New Zealand on his own. So he wasn't very happy in England, and somehow or other, remembering this New Zealand connection, that where he had been born, but he would have had no living memory of it if he had left when he was only 2 years old. So as an 18-year-old boy, 1912 it was, he jumps on a ship, goes back to New Zealand, and he winds up as a dairy hand on a dairy farm in the Taranaki region in 1912. And there he is. That's a couple of cousins, some of the children of one of his mother's sisters, and that's what he would have looked like about 18 years old when he was back in New Zealand. And of course, World War I rolls along a couple of years later. August 1914, it breaks out. And Grandad was one of those very early volunteers. So he signed up August 1914, the month the war broke out. And this has been one of the fun parts. which is just trying to reconstruct what's going on. We didn't know what unit he was in, we didn't know where he was, but fortunately the New Zealand government's been absolutely fantastic with its archiving and making its records available online. So if there's a New Zealand soldier who served in World War I, his record has been scanned and is freely available through the New Zealand government archives, every single one. So we're able to pull the scanned, handwritten copies of his entire World War I file, which had lots of really interesting information in it. And that at least gave me the town where he signed up, which was just a tiny little country town called Matapu. I didn't even know where it was. And other things, and then other things just trying to reconstruct what was going on. I managed to find a diary that was written by a guy who was in the same unit as him. And included in the diary, for example, was this hand-drawn little diagram of a racetrack where the New Zealand soldiers from his region were mobilizing. And because I know his unit, I can say that little blotch there was where his unit was. So I even got down to the point of being able to know exactly where they would have pitched their tents, and some fascinating little details about how they went for a route march to harden up the men, and they stopped by and went into a local house and asked for some fresh drinks and just thought they'd get some water. Next thing they know, bread and scones and buns and lemonade and everything appeared, and then all the men went round and raised a bit of extra money. And there was a funny thing, because he was actually, I'm getting ahead of myself, but he was actually in a medical unit. It was sort of like Americans would call it a MASH unit, a mobile field hospital. So all their officers were actually surgeons. None of them were really military men. They were just got colonels and majors and captains without having any experience in the military thing. And in this account, it said all the men chuckled, who were regular troopers, because this captain said, "Would you fall in, please?" Which is obviously not how officers are supposed to talk to their men. So all the men kind of had a bit of a chuckle about him not being a real officer, not really knowing how it was done. And there he is, ready to go off to war, August 1914. Now, one of the things which was fascinating how language changes over time, because I know when I certainly started reading his military file, I was completely wrong about what he was doing. So his rank was driver, and his unit was the New Zealand Mounted Field Ambulance. So he was a driver in an ambulance. And anybody today hearing those words would think they knew what it meant. He drove an ambulance. That's certainly what I originally thought it meant. But back then, driver had absolutely nothing to do with driving a vehicle. It was actually a rank from the Royal Horse Artillery, and you might be more familiar with it as in a cattle drive, people who look after the animals. So in fact, a driver was a private who was in charge of looking after horses. And an ambulance back then wasn't a vehicle, it was a unit. So the ambulance was a mobile field hospital. So the ambulance doesn't refer to a vehicle at all. It refers to the entire unit with the surgeons and the handlers and all of the rest. And he was attached to the unit. Apparently he absolutely hated horses. But because he'd been working on a dairy farm, the wisdom of the army was basically, you're on a dairy farm, you know about animals, therefore now you're a driver, go look after the horses. Apparently he absolutely hated them. But he got stuck with them. So he was a driver, a private in charge of looking after horses in an ambulance, a mobile field, and that's a picture in fact of the New Zealand Mounted Field Ambulance. That's not an ambulance, the whole lot of it is the ambulance. And so it's been quite fascinating just reconstructing the whole voyage. So all of the men were assembled down in Wellington Harbour. They had 10 merchant ships they requisitioned. And there's one, not actually Grandad's ship, that particular photo, but you get the general idea of some of the men, New Zealanders, getting ready. They took thousands of horses along with them as well, so you can imagine the amount of work that involved every day caring for them. They had some losses, but apparently overall they were extremely pleased with how many horses managed to survive this extremely long voyage. And that was the General Godley, who was in charge of the entire New Zealand forces. And sometimes I feel like I'm almost reconstructing a little bit of a Forrest Gump story. You know, Forrest Gump is always there at all these important places, but never the main guy. He's sort of always in the background. And Grandad very frequently is kind of like that. So my good fortune is that he happened to be on the same ship as the General. So it was the New Zealand flag transport. So as a result, when you're reading the accounts, you get plenty of accounts of what's going on aboard that ship. With accounts aboard the other ship are frequently mentioning that ship because they're frequently getting wireless traffic coming from the General. Everybody pays attention to it. Also is good fortune, for example, sometimes when they pulled into port, there weren't enough berths for all the ships. Of course, the General's ship always gets to pull in. So in that sense, it was his good fortune to be on the same ship as the General. So that's the General aboard. Now this photo, I got used to seeing that quite frequently on websites about the fleet, websites with photos and collections going on. It's a classic picture, of a New Zealand mother wishing, the New Zealand boy a sergeant farewell. You can just see the expression on her face. You come back safe to me. You don't take any unnecessary risks. All those kind of things. And quite to my surprise, I was very familiar with this photo. I eventually stumbled on the archive where the collection of a whole photo album was assembled, which included this photo, and realized that the man who took that photo was in the same unit as my grandfather, which meant that was no longer just to me a random photo of some New Zealand mother saying goodbye to some New Zealand boy. For all I know, my grandfather might be standing here, or my grandfather might be standing over there. That's a boy about to get on the same ship as my grandfather. He's in the same unit as my grandfather. So suddenly that photo went from being sort of a general image of it to something much more specific to my grandfather's story. And that actually is a photo of Wellington Harbour at the time, and the fleet assembling with the boys ready to go. And then, there we go. And this one was an absolutely beautiful story. I've actually been scripting out, little by little, hopefully maybe I might be able to persuade Television New Zealand or somebody like that to try and turn this into a bit of a TV series. I've been getting some advice from some scriptwriters I know. And you always want to have a bit of a love interest or some interesting little story. And this was absolutely beautiful because there was a wedding aboard his ship one day before they sailed off to war. And I managed to confirm this. I managed to track down. It was a little hard to find him because his name, as you see, was it Field? Arthur Field. Very generic name, didn't have much to go on. But I managed to find his file and confirm all the details. And so the story goes like this. The reason the fleet all assembled in Wellington was because they were very nervous about a bunch of German heavy cruisers. They had been stationed in China, and when the war broke out, they vanished. Nobody knew where they'd gone. They were somewhere in the Pacific, and if they got in the midst of all these transport ships, there would be a lot of New Zealand boys dying if these heavy crew and the escorts they had available had no chance of standing up to these German heavy cruisers. They didn't know where they were. Then they were spotted off Samoa, which meant they'd come down from China, much closer to New Zealand, and there were rumours spreading around they'd been seen off the coast of New Zealand. In fact, a couple of the New Zealand ships had already embarked heading towards Australia. The New Zealand Prime Minister got on the wireless and said, "Come back now!" And these men found diary entries, these New Zealanders aboard the ships. They had the big fanfare, the parades, the bands played. They sailed out, they went to sleep. They woke up the next morning back in harbour and said, what's going on? And then they were all ordered to assemble. And there was even a constitutional crisis because, again, being a colony under the British Crown, the Prime Minister said, "We're not going until you send us a decent escort to protect our ships that can stand up to these German heavy cruisers." And the Governor-General said, "Well, I represent the King, and I say they sail." And the Prime Minister said, "No, they don't." And the Governor-General said, "Yes, they do." And the Prime Minister said, "In that case, I quit, and the entire New Zealand Cabinet goes with me." So you have, and then the Governor-General then had to back down because the last thing they want at the beginning of World War I is a constitutional crisis with an entire colonial government resigning in protest about the treatment. So basically, there's a delay. None of the ships sail. They were supposed to sail in September. They're all summoned down to Wellington in the protected harbour until they can have a decent military escort arrive. Now, this story of the wedding, the girl, he was a reservist down in New Zealand. His fiancée, before the war had broken out, had gone on a steamship, was on her way down to New Zealand. If they had sailed on time in September, he would have gone off to war. she would have arrived in New Zealand only to find out that her fiance was long gone. Only because of this whole big delay, because of the German cruisers, was there just enough time for her to get into port, track down her man, find out that he was on the transport, marry him just the day before they sailed, and then off they went. And the other nice thing about being able to find these files, I found Field's file and he survived. So he didn't get back to New Zealand until 1919, and she did remain in New Zealand waiting for him, so she presumably, it doesn't say in the files, but she presumably got one night with her husband and then didn't see him again for another 5 years until he eventually would return. So we even have a beautiful little love interest story before they embark. And and these ships here, one of the other fascinating little chapters is the two ships. One was the HMS Minotaur, a British heavy cruiser, and the other was the Ibuki, a Japanese heavy cruiser, because the Japanese were an ally in World War I, and the Japanese provided a bunch of escorts. So in fact, it was the first time a heavy Japanese warship had ever visited New Zealand waters. They would actually go with them all the way to the Middle East. So that's another sort of little interesting oddity in the story, having a Japanese cruiser escort them. And then we have lots of beautiful things. This was a hand-drawn little map of what the New Zealand fleet looked like after they sailed out of Wellington Harbour. So there's the Minotaur leading them off. Off to the north, which was on their, hang on, I was going to say right flank, but we're talking about ships, so there's got to be port.
Starboard.
Hang on, just a second. Yeah, right, starboard, absolutely right, thank you. Yeah, port's left, starboard's right, yeah. So on their starboard flank, which was would have been to their north as they were heading in that direction, the most likely direction the Germans would have come from if they were coming anywhere. They had the Japanese cruiser and a couple of other little New Zealand cruisers escorting them. And there's the Maunganui, number 3, my grandfather's ship, leading up at the front. So that's as they sail across. Now, they stop in Hobart, Tasmania. They have a big parade. All sorts of big counts I found of them really enjoying the apples. Apparently the apples must have been spectacular. Lots of different accounts mention how good the apples were. The people were giving them apples left, right and centre as they marched through. And then they sailed across here, and these are little things to remind me of little things to mention. A couple of interesting incidents there. They lose their first man. He dies of food poisoning when they're in the Great Australian Bight, south of Australia. And they had this massive funeral. It was probably the biggest funeral a New Zealander has ever had. The transport ship with the dead man stayed in the middle. The other 9 transports gathered all around it. The warships gathered all around it. There was 10,000 men, 10 troop ships, 4 warships, all in state. In all of World War I, he was just a regular private, but probably the biggest funeral of anyone in World War I. And then they stopped in Albany, and that's, they had just, because it's April the 25th is our big war memorial day, where we wear poppies and everything, not November the 11th. They're having big events all over Australia and New Zealand because of the time zones. They're already going on now. They've already had their dawn services and all of the rest. And Albany is a place where they always have big events, because that's where the fleet assembles. In addition to the 10 New Zealand transport and 10,000 New Zealanders, there's 20,000 Australians who are also gathering there with a bunch of extra warships. So by the time they're heading out from there, they've got a fleet of 30,000 men. They've got multiple warships. It's one of the biggest merchant convoys of ships all the way. And then all sorts of other things happen along the way. Up here, this is one of those classic tales. They really need to make a movie out of this one. There's a German commerce raider. There's a German light cruiser, which didn't, oh, I forgot to tell you, those German heavy cruisers didn't go anywhere in New Zealand. They actually go off to Chile. They sink several British ships off the coast of Chile, cross around South America, and eventually get defeated around the Falkland Islands and the South Atlantic. That's where they went. But before they headed off to South America, they detached a German light cruiser that just went berserk around the Indian Ocean. It sank dozens of merchantmen. They had British ships left, right and centre out there trying to hunt them down, and they were doing all sorts of, they had 3 funnels, so they mocked up a 4th fake funnel, sailed into Penang Harbour. There was a Russian cruiser there, torpedoed the Russian cruiser, sailed back out again, and so they were going nuts all around the Indian Ocean. And they actually said from their memoirs, if they had found this convoy, they would have just waited to the middle of the night, sailed in the middle of it, and shot torpedoes left, right and centre until the escorts could have sunk them or something like that. And what they didn't know was that actually they were within 12 hours of each other in the middle of the night. They crossed bows. So they, and so there was a whole exciting thing where there was the Cocos Islands, where there was a radio station with cables. The Germans decided to stop there and destroy the radio station and cut the cables. Because they were so close, they were jamming the SOS, but the SOS got through to one single New Zealand transport. Only one wireless operator picked up the SOS, and then they sent off the Australian warship, the Sydney, and that was an epic battle. So you can imagine the Australian Navy makes a huge big deal about it. The Sydney defeats the Emden and all the rest, books and all of the rest. And this is now a diagram by an Australian who was aboard one of the Australian transports of what the fleet looked like. So you can see it's much bigger now. They were in 3 columns with warships all around. This interesting thing there. One of the things that didn't impress the New Zealanders had all had their transport ships painted grey, in good standard military colours, and they arrived there and the Australians hadn't bothered. So they called it the Rainbow Fleet. It had reds and blues and whites and things all around. So the Australian fleet were all bright coloured. And then something which the New Zealanders absolutely love, the Minotaur, the head warship, sent this wireless when they're in the ocean, saying to the Australians, please keep station. You need to stay 1 mile apart. If you're straggling, some of you were straggling as much as 3 miles. We saw lights coming from this ship. We saw lights coming from that ship. You're not maintaining good light security. This is very dangerous. This makes our job much, much harder. Please do a better job. To the New Zealand fleet. Excellent station keeping, excellent light security. Keep up the good work. So you can imagine the New Zealanders like that part a lot. So we have the New Zealand Expeditionary Force and the Australian Imperial Force. Those are the terms. They're not yet called ANZACs. Later on, they will come to be called the ANZACs, Australia New Zealand Army Corps, when the units are combined together. And that gives us Anzac Day, April the 25th, which is an anniversary of something I haven't got to yet, but we'll get to that in just a moment. And then, this is when my grand trying to reconstruct again all these things we had no idea about. So I found in his medical files, these are all the different things. You can see he was hospitalised with influenza at one point and all sorts of other things. And while he's aboard the fleet, just before, in fact, they get to Albany in Australia for the fleet to assemble, he's diagnosed with measles and hospitalised aboard ship with measles. You can imagine measles as an adult male is not a good thing. And so all I had here was the date he was hospitalised with it, the date he got out, and there's a whole month he's hospitalised with measles, and he's got recovered there. In fact, I know from that name there, Ernest Thomas, that was the colonel of his unit. So who was in, he was obviously a doctor as well. So then I have this image in my head. Okay, Grandad was really, really sick for an entire month of the voyage. And this must have been very serious, his life must have been threatened. This is all the impression I got. It's completely wrong. And only again, the reason I kind of got obsessed with this, if I just did a little bit of research, found everything there was, then it would be kind of, that was interesting, move on. But every time I dig, I find more and more stuff. And one of the things I found, which was absolutely unbelievable to me, was a typewritten shipboard newspaper that was published, self-typed and published, well, not really published, just typed up really, by one of the men aboard his ship. It's called the Ocean Chronicle. And apparently this was, since I've started digging, I found a number of these from different troop ships. It was quite a custom that the men would just sort of fire up the little, well, it's not a printing press exactly, they had a little printing machine aboard these ships.
Mimeograph.
Yeah, those things. And so there it is. And then that little section there, which I'll enlarge for you, says, both hospitals on board seem to be well patronised. There being 7 in the infectious hospital, all of whom are looking very healthy, which goes to say much of the medical attention they are receiving. So suddenly I have this fascinating little detail. Okay, that's Grandad. That's Grandad and 6 other men. So now I know that there's 6 of them, but still, they must be pretty sick, you would imagine. Except for the fact, when you turn over the page, there is a poem included in there called Infectious Hospital Doggerel. And I've cut out 4, I mean, it's quite long actually, and it's not the best poetry, but you'll understand why, since this poem is published when he's in the quarantine ward. And here's some second. The patients in the infectious hospital are hoping that their period of isolation will last till the hot weather is over. The following poem gives their feelings. Because, by the way, if they were not in the hospital, they would be mucking out the horses. Can you imagine what, the horses had to be walked every day, the horses had to be mucked. Can you imagine what the below deck smelled like with all the horse pee and everything else? So we hope until we get out of the tropics. Infectious hospital logo. A subject choice is hard to find, but still I'll do my best. Infectious wards are on my mind and fill me with unrest. We had the measles long while back, but they've gone long ago. And what we're isolated for is what we want to know. We have a lazy time indeed, it sometimes makes me blush. Now all we do is drink and feed and smoke and sleep, but hush. We've landed in a comfy nest, in fact it's just a gift. To see us chaps at meal times, well, 'twould make you write a song. The way we clean the platters up, there can't be much that's wrong. But oh, the heat here is intense, we melt away like cheese. We've kept the reason has some sense, for there we spread disease. So apparently when you got measles, it would last at most a week. And after that, they kept them in quarantine for an entire month because you desperately do not want quarantine spreading among the rest of the men. So turned out, thanks to that, that was just a miracle as far as I was concerned of research, to be able to pin down, I didn't even know he had measles. And to get it down to the fact that he had measles, I've got the dates he had measles, I've got the fact that there were 7 men in the infectious ward, and we've even got a poem written by one of the guys who was there, basically saying, yep, it's eat, drink, smoke and talk, nothing else to do. And so eventually they will end up in Egypt. I'll just cycle back to that map I had a moment ago. Up there. So they stop in Sri Lanka, they get shore leave, Grandad doesn't because he's in quarantine. You just imagine looking out the portal while other men get to go ashore. Then they coal at Aden, and one of the interesting things, that exclamation mark there, is it's about that point that they find out they're going to get out in Egypt. Until that point, they're all convinced they're on their way to England. They're going to fight on the Western Front, they're going to be in the trenches, they're on the way to England. In fact, it's only round about here in the middle of the Indian Ocean that Turkey joins the war. Turkey isn't even in the war when the war breaks out. So the idea that they will fight the Turks doesn't even register in their minds. And so it's only as they're approaching the Suez Canal, they start getting word, no, you're not going to England after all, you're getting off in Egypt, we might need you around in this region. So they get off in Egypt. Yeah, this is like a wood. Here we go. And that same collection of photos from that guy who had the mother saying goodbye to her boy at the port had a bunch of other ones. Now, you can't really tell from this photo, if the caption didn't tell you, those men are actually on top of one of the pyramids. Because when they arrived in Egypt, the New Zealanders and the Australians were all camped around this area just outside of Cairo. The Australians were directly under the pyramids, and the New Zealanders were just down the road, and it was a regular thing that everybody would go and climb the pyramids. It was just one of the things you did. So this is actually the uniform that my grandfather would have been wearing. It's men from his unit standing atop. If you really study it, you can kind of see there's a distant view in the background to tell they're kind of elevated. And I'm extremely relieved to say this is an Australian. You can tell from the way his cap is tilted on the side, because what he's actually doing there, he's busy carving his name. Oh. You see, he's down there carving away at the stones on the top of the pyramid. So I'm extremely relieved that he's Australian, not New Zealand. These are the New Zealand boys. And this photo, this one again, that's his colonel. I can barely make him out in the background. And this is kit inspection at their camp in Egypt. So there's a reasonable chance that my grandfather is one of these men, and at very least, again, from going from, well, not really knowing any part of this part. I mean, I knew he'd been in Egypt, and that was about it. We get photos of the campsite, we get photos of what their tents look like, we get photos of what kit inspection would look like. And this photo, again, from the same thing. These are 2 men that are in his unit, just getting a photo taken out. And fascinatingly enough, this man there, one of the other family records we have, remember I said my grandfather had 2 older sisters, there were 3 of them? One of them died at 9 years old of diphtheria in London, but the other one survived, and one of the things we have from her is an autograph album. That mostly it's sort of girls from her 6th form college and different people who sign things, but I found an autograph in there from a guy's name with NZ, New Zealand MC, NZMC, New Zealand Medical Corps, and it had his name, and fascinatingly, and so it was in 1917 or 1916, I think it was, that he went and visited my grandfather's elder sister in London, where she was living. And thanks to the notes on the back of it and a couple of other photos, I was able to identify it was him. He's actually the guy who went and visited. So, and the reason I know it was him, and I could identify it, finding his military file, was because after my grandfather was shot in the shoulder, he had been wounded at Gallipoli. They both ended up at the same convalescent hospital in England. And you can only guess that this guy got leave and didn't know anybody in England, and my grandfather must have said, well, if you got leave, you're going to London, why don't you go and look at my father and my sister, they're in London. And so I actually found his autograph in my, it'll be my great auntie's autograph book. And then other sort of little sad stories. These are the kind of things which scripting out, I've actually been finding scripting it out as a TV series, it's almost writing itself, because you need funny little episodes or tragic little episodes. And this guy, Captain Bell, was in his unit, and they just arrived in Egypt. It was late December, just after Christmas. He complained of some sort of problem in his head, was admitted to hospital, and then next thing they know, they said he fell out of bed, had a fit, and 10 minutes later he was dead. So, he gets me, he's the one, in fact, he's the officer who earlier on was the one who didn't know how to give the men orders. From that day, the one who said, could you all fall in, please? And all the men laughed at him. And so they had, and it was a big farce at a funeral. The officers went to the hospital to get the body, and they hadn't got the proper paperwork, so they had to muck around. A major was leading all the men in the unit to find it, and he got lost trying to find his way to the cemetery. All the generals and all the high officials turned up for the funeral, and then on the way home, a horse got spooked by a camel, threw one of the men, he fell off, hit his head and died, and then they had to have another funeral. So again, it's World War I, and you imagine all the deaths and the gunfire, but we had this guy who died of food poisoning in the ship, another guy who died of flu on the way, and then this guy just had other thing, the guy falls off his horse. It was a sort of a steady attrition long before they ever got into combat. And this gravestone, I found it within that same album, and I found it says that he was very popular with the men, and all the men chipped in to help pay for his gravestone. And in fact, you can't see it there, but down there it says, gravestone paid for by the officers and men of his unit. So that granddad would have had a small part, a few shillings or something perhaps, or pennies, I don't know what would have been the going rate for donations in that gravestone. And then, this one, one of the things, the really beautiful documents, I found the unit diaries of the New Zealand Mounted Field Ambulance. It only starts up once they arrive in Egypt. It's that colonel, and he's telling it all, and he mentions so many different individual people doing so many lots of little things. I've been having all sorts of fun. They mention a person's name, I see if I can find out who that person is. And several times he mentions this guy, Private Andrus. Here's one example of an entry from 8th of December. Tried twice to get higher authority to deal with Private Andrus's case, but both referred it back on account of some technical error in my mode of procedure. Crime sheet stated that he had returned to camp twice drunk, was disrespectful to an officer, broke camp against definite orders, and remained away nearly 48 hours. So and I found out later actually, he died in 1918. I found his gravestone. He lied about his age. Most men lied about their age because they were 16 or 17. He lied about his age to make himself young enough. 40 was the maximum, and his gravestone from 1918 says he's 47. So if you see from 1914 signing up, you see he was too old. He was sort of an old salt lying about his age to make himself younger to get himself in, and obviously was up to no good. And this, don't worry about the handwritten stuff yet. I didn't put it up there on the PowerPoint. It's such a good story. So Private Andrus is always getting into trouble. And when I found his file, there were all sorts of handwritten notes in there, all about his court-martial in early 1915. And the story, reconstructing from all witness statements, they had lineups and witness statements and all the other things, seems to go something like this. The story seems to start because there's a local Egyptian barber who lives near the camp, And his name is Levi Sada, which is Salvatore Levi Sada. Which makes me, is he an Italian Jew or what is he? It's a really interesting name. And he has an employee called Mustafa Ramadan. You'd imagine that you'd be making up these names. And he fires his employee. And his employee is obviously rather annoyed with his former boss. So he goes looking for a New Zealand officer with a red cross on his shoulder and says, "My boss has been buying black market goods from a New Zealand soldier with a red cross on his sleeve." This sparks a whole investigation, and eventually Private Andrus is accused of selling company stores to this Egyptian barber. And being Egypt, the fact he's accused of selling 8 pounds of butter, 8 pounds of cheese, and 4 pounds of bacon, which, being Egypt and things, is also very ironic. Anyway, so and they have a lineup. The barber's put up there, and they line up, and he says, "Yes, that's the guy who was selling it to me," because he's not the one getting in trouble. They're going after the New Zealander who's selling it. So there's a court-martial trial, and they put him on the witness stand. And the barber says, yes, this is the man who sold me it, but he told me it was his private property. I had no idea they were company, army store goods that I was buying. I never realized. He lied to me. And he came to my shop several times, and one time he stayed at my house for dinner, and I gave him some medicine for his venereal disease. And then it says, at this point, Private Andrus strongly objected and demanded to be inspected. So as soon as the barber had finished giving his witness statements, Private Andrus was duly inspected by the doctors present and pronounced to be clean. Then they put Mustafa Ramadan on the witness stand, and they say, "Is this the man that you saw selling company goods to your former employer?" And he says, "I've never seen this man before in my life." And I can't help imagining some sort of backstory there where the other New Zealanders have found him saying, "You don't dare finger our guy or you're in trouble." And besides, I don't think he ever wanted to get the New Zealander in trouble anyway. He was after his former boss. So whatever the case dismissed. And here we have notes here. And this is from their Colonel Thomas. And he says, I would respectfully point out that in the event of the weight of evidence being against Private Andrus, the man is of a highly nervous temperament and has undergone the equivalent of severe punishment by being kept in suspense as to the result of the inquiry held originally on January 13th, 1915. So he's a nervous wreck. Go easy on the guy. He's kind of been punished already. And then the judge writes back, well, because of the conflicts of evidence, I wouldn't give a conviction anyway, case dismissed. And Colonel Thomas notes at the bottom, noted with satisfaction. And Andrus does die of a heart condition in 18. So I guess he really did have a nervous disposition. And then one of the other notes that's in the private thing, one single note, it says, Mrs. Goodchild has been very helpful driving her own motor for us as an ambulance. That's all there was. But I managed to find her file and track down all sorts of interesting things. And she's an article I'm working on right now in her own right. This one single reference to Mrs. Goodchild. She's an absolutely fascinating lady. She was an English woman living in Egypt in 1914 when all the New Zealanders turned up. For reasons why we don't know exactly why, she had her own motor vehicle. She approached the New Zealanders and said, "Can I help out?" And so this was her own private motor vehicle. It's a Model T Ford, I believe. I've been trying to compare the profiles. I think it's a Model T. And they converted it to be used as an ambulance. And she drove it around. Later on, when the New Zealanders eventually go to France and England, she goes with them. 16, she goes with them. She drives to the New Zealanders in England. She runs their motor repair workshop in one of the hospitals. She's changing all the tyres. She volunteers for the Red Cross and goes across to France. Her request to drive for the New Zealanders is refused, so she quits and goes back to England and drives for the New Zealanders in England again. Why she's so attached to the New Zealanders, I've been trying to work out, I did find out, apparently the rules for the English hospitals were stupidly strict about times they could go out and whether they could fraternize with men and all of these other very, very strict rules. The New Zealanders were much more relaxed, had much fewer stupid rules, and paid them better. So all sorts of better reasons to want to drive with the New Zealanders. She eventually, one of the things she does, there's a training for men who have lost limbs. She runs a workshop training New Zealanders who have lost limbs and how to change tyres, which was much more challenging back in those vehicles they were using in World War I. And eventually she gets given an MBE. She gets honour from the King in 1918. When the war's over, she goes on a New Zealand transport ship back to Egypt, and she eventually dies in Egypt in 1979. And I actually managed, funnily enough, through a distant relative of hers, kind of like a half nephew. It's complicated to describe who it is, who always knew about these two sisters, Valerie Goodchild and her sister Vere, who went off to Egypt in 1910. They'd never seen photos of them. They'd never met them. They only kind of knew that they existed. Always wondered what they looked like. And in the course of my researches, I've actually managed to track down not one but 4 different photos of Goodchild. And I've since forwarded to the family members who said that his family is all terribly excited because they'd never even seen an image of her. And I found in that photo album of that New Zealander who was in the same unit, you know, the same one with the boys going away, there were 2 photos of her, and this one with her vehicle. And it's got a very unique profile. I've compared it to all the other ambulances. I know if I ever see a photo of her ambulance, I'm going to recognize it in Egypt because it's got a different profile from all the others. It's shorter for a start. You see, no man would be able to even lie down in the back. And interesting enough, another guy I stumbled on, T.E. Lawrence, you might know him better as Lawrence of Arabia. I found another guy who'd been talking about a Captain Goodchild, who'd been involved with the Arab Revolt and things like this, and I tracked him down, and he had just gone to a garage sale in Cambridge, England, bought a diary, didn't even know what it was, just randomly purchased it, and eventually worked out that this guy had been involved with buying camels to give to the Arabs for the Arab Revolt, and had been one of the hangers-on with Lawrence of Arabia in the Arab Revolt. And I emailed him, is your Goodchild any relation to the Goodchild I've been reading? Oh yes, that's her husband. And he gave me a bunch of interesting little data. I said, oh, Ham, but you're already doing it. No, I'm writing about the husband. You can do the wife. Here's a bunch of smart stuff I found out about the wife. So all sorts of fascinating things about her. So really, I mean, even her bankrupty con man father, who after the mother died went bankrupt, went into hiding so that the courts couldn't find him, shacked up with another woman, didn't marry her, had 8 kids, and eventually married her and registered all the kids at the same time in the 1920s. You can imagine, this might not be so rare these days, but back then he was a fascinating character in his own right. Okay, that was Valerie Goodchild. And then Gallipoli comes along. Now that's where April the 25th comes up. April the 25th is the anniversary of the landings at Gallipoli. And Gallipoli was a bloody catastrophe, to put it frankly. It was, think D-Day with World War I trenches with the Turks on the cliffs above. So you've got cliffs, you've got beach landings. Basically they landed, they got stuck on the cliffs, they couldn't get off. They were there from April the 25th to December. They never got, there were very few places that were even out of range of sniper fire or anything like this. It was, and the whole campaign was all about trying to open a way through to the Black Sea to supply the Russians to try and keep them in the war. It was a disaster. Thousands of New Zealanders and Australians died. It's become a pilgrimage point. To go to Gallipoli on April the 25th is sort of a almost a New Zealand pilgrimage, or an Australian pilgrimage now. Now, Grandad was lucky enough not to be there on April the 25th. Actually, his luck was those men's bad fortune, because they had no idea they were going to suffer so many casualties and be stuck there so long, so they didn't have adequate hospital coverage, they didn't have the medical units there, they didn't have the hospital ships there. So it was only the next month in May that Grandad's unit, the Mounted Field Ambulance, got summoned, come up, we need doctors and stretcher bearers and all of the rest. So they mounted that ship. That in fact is actually his ship, loading the wagons. again, Grandad could well be somewhere in that photo or just out of shot. The Kingstonian is sent up, and the chaos and disorganisation of war, they get there, they're off the coast, they see Cape Helles, they see Gabatepe, which are two of the places, and they're told, there's nowhere for you to land, we don't have any space for you. They're dug in on the cliffs. And so they're sent, well, I don't know, just go transship to a hospital ship. So they're sent back to Lemnos, the Greek island, which has submarine nets which they can save. And they've realised at this point that horses and wagons are absolutely no use in this kind of terrain. So they determine that the horses and wagons and the men who care for them will be sent back to Egypt while the rest of the unit lands. As a result, Grandad doesn't land at Gallipoli and is sent back to Egypt and spends the next rest of the year just mucking around in Egypt, looking after the horses and so on, while his unit's there. I mean, even the colonel, that Colonel Thomas, the one who wrote the letter, you know, please go easy on private, he's killed by an artillery shell. It's a nasty time. So again, by the skin of his teeth, he avoids having to be at Gallipoli. And then, and there's a scene of what they would have been like just looking after the horses, mass horse lines, because eventually they had a whole bunch of mounted battalions, and at first only the infantry were landed, but as they were running out of troops, they told all the mounted units, leave your horses in Egypt, we need you as well. So the men had to remain behind looking after all these horses that couldn't be used. And eventually, they evacuate Gallipoli at the end of 15, and they are then reorganised. Some of them will stay in the Middle East, and there's a whole Middle Eastern campaign. There's a famous Australian movie called The Light Horseman. It features like actually a World War I cavalry charge against Turkish positions and all sorts of things like this. Interesting enough, with mounted field ambulances really prominently featuring in that movie. And if he had stayed in his unit, he would have been a part of that campaign. But he transfers out, and we don't know why, and we don't even know what unit he went into, but there's one little, on his service record, it has New Zealand Mounted Field Ambulance crossed out, it has Field Bakery crossed out, and then it has his next unit in it. And again, I asked around the family, have you ever heard of Grandad being in the Field Bakery? No, never heard of it. That's the only reference anywhere in the file, but it has to be at this point. And again, searching through the files, it mentioned 2 men transferred out on the same day, and I looked up the other man's file, and he was a former baker who went to the Field Bakery, and it's even the same handwriting on the form saying Field Bakery. So my guess is Grandad didn't want to stay in the Middle East, he wanted to go to England. There was another guy in his unit saying, I'm a baker, I'm going to come along with me. And I mean, I'm imagining that scenario, but at least I can say that the other guy was a trained baker, and he was sent across to the bakery. So in Grandad's file it says he went to the bakery. So I'm assuming at this point he was in the Army Service Corps, logistics, not a combat frontline unit, and that's how he ended up in France. And the New Zealanders are sent, again, I'll butcher the French name, Armentières, I'm sure that's nothing like how a French person would say it. They're sent to a part near the border between France and Belgium to hold the line there. Initially it's rather quiet, but the New Zealanders decide they don't want it to be quiet, so they start launching trench raids and all sorts of things like this. And then on July the 14th, he suffers a GSW, which is gunshot wounds, any kind of shrapnel or bullet or something like that, that's what the file calls it, to the shoulder, and he's sent to number 2 casualty clearing station, which is in that town there. And thinking, well, how does a baker or somebody in a bakery unit, you can imagine, or maybe it's, he's bringing up the bread to the front lines and, there's shelling behind or something. How does he get wounded in the shoulder? But I have a theory, I can't prove it, but I've got enough evidence to at least make it a strong suspicion. That, because I was looking, what happened on July 13th, the night of July 13th, there was an utter disaster for one of the New Zealand battalions. They decided to get ambitious with those trench raids. The trench raids have been doing pretty well. They got a platoon would sneak across, bash a few Germans on the head, take a couple of prisoners, come back. They decided to get ambitious. They were going to do it in company strength. So from an Otago battalion, they got an entire company. They snuck out into no man's land. They lay down in the mud, and waited, and then there was going to be a short barrage, and then they were going to go. They were all ready. They had, you know, knuckle dusters and spike clubs and everything like this. And the Germans had seen enough of what was going on, or got wise to it. And the moment that the barrage, the Germans normally would shell behind the lines. The Germans opened up with artillery and machine gun fire, all of it aimed at no man's land. Basically, as soon as the New Zealanders jumped up to charge forward, every officer was killed or wounded. There was nobody to order a cancellation or a retreat. The company was obliterated. There was a handful of men who got back uninjured. And then after all the shelling's gone on, they spent the rest of the night, stretcher bearers, crawling out to no man's land, dragging the dead and wounded back in. And I found various accounts of this. I found an account of one of the men who was giving flanking protection to no man's land. He was hiding in a shell hole just away from where all the shells were falling. I found another account of a guy who was actually out there crawling along, and he said the Germans had a machine gun in the pitch black just on a traverse, so the moment you heard it opening up, you just had to go flat on your face in the dirt. And he said, I forgot to lock, you can imagine if you falling in, your heels would poke up. I forgot to flatten my feet, and immediately bullets went through the back of my boot and my leg went flying, but he only just got a scratch. The guy, he said, who was beside me, who hadn't been under fire before, he went down, and you imagine you're going down ready to jump up, his hands were like that, immediately got 3 bullets through his forearm. So that's how flat you had to be to avoid this machine gun fire. And the fascinating thing, that account mentioned the name of the guy who got the 3 bullets through his forearm, and I was able to find his military file and confirm gunshot wound, right forearm. I definitely confirm it's the right guy. And at very least, he was sent on the same day to the same casualty clearing station as my grandfather. So at least in that sense, I know that they were getting every available man out there as stretcher bearers. They were out there till dawn dragging them in. So my imagined scenario is that he could have well been around delivering the bread and say, well, every man on deck out there dragging the men back in. So it could have been something, well, just caught in some random artillery fire or something like this, but at least it's enough to make it an interesting suspicion. So that's how he gets his shoulder wound. And there it is, the New Zealand disaster, dragging him back in. It didn't go well, that's the short version. And so the New Zealanders actually had got their own private hospitals in England to run. They weren't under English administration. And they had taken over a noble estate called Hornchurch. And this was where New Zealanders got to recover and recuperate. That's where Grandad was sent. That's where he met that other fellow, the guy who would go and visit his sister in London, who we saw at photo by the Sphinx. And so he spent quite a while recovering there. He was promoted to be a temporary sergeant, a company clerk, bookkeeper, keeping track of company records while he was there. And after that, after he recovered, he was sent to Sling. There's, again, the New Zealand camp, not far from Stonehenge. And they even put the Kiwi up on the hill. And this is the camp where they hardened the men who had recovered. Some men were judged too ill, they were sent back to New Zealand, they couldn't be sent back in service. He took quite a few months to get over that shoulder wound, and he was sent there, and then he was then sent for training on heavy machine guns. Why exactly he went there at this point? I don't know, but that was his next deployment. He was sent to this place, Belton Park. I even found a fascinating documentary online, which was, I don't know if I'd call it archaeology. Can you really have World War I archaeology? To me, archaeology is things about Roman and Greek history, but it was an archaeology of World War I. And they went to Belton Park and they were digging up sort of the places where the guys had done their machine gun training and stuff like this, which was fascinating because I knew that's where Grandad went and had his machine gun training. And so he is now in second half of 1917, having been in the New Zealand Mounted Field Ambulance and with probably the Field Bakery, he's now in the New Zealand Machine Gun Corps, the New Zealand Machine Gun Battalion. And he's deployed to France, and he arrives in France in late October 1917. And the reason what he missed, again, why I'm here, why any of my family are here, why my children are here, or any of the rest. So he just avoided landing at Gallipoli, which was a bloodbath for New Zealanders, thousands of men dead. He was literally on the ship, saw the place, sent back. The fact that he got wounded in the middle of 16 turned out to be a good thing, because that meant he missed the worst and most bloody months of the Somme, where again thousands of boys were killed. Well, the Somme, 1 million, not just New Zealanders obviously, but absolutely catastrophic battles. And then the day, most people remember the Somme and other ones, but for New Zealanders, it's actually October 1917, just literally a few days before he got back. That is always remembered by the New Zealanders, because Passchendaele is the worst day of the war for New Zealanders. I believe Antietam for Americans is sort of the worst day, more Americans killed in the Battle of Antietam than any other day. Passchendaele, October 1917, is the worst day in New Zealand history, for more New Zealanders dying that day. So his shoulder wound keeps him out for the worst of the Somme, and the New Zealand units are absolutely shattered. And I found the records of saying the units were brought back from the front line, off the trenches, to rest and recover and replenish their numbers with reinforcements. And Grandad was one of those reinforcements coming in to one of those shattered units. And so ironically, that shoulder wound kept him out of, well, again, he was in from August 1914. Just, if he hadn't been out, would he have survived the war? Well, probably not. And then other nice little things. The New Zealand Prime Minister comes out to visit the New Zealand boys. He visits my granddad's unit. That is the New Zealand Prime Minister visiting the New Zealand Machine Gun Battalion. And now I've zoomed up as best as I can on every face that's visible, looking for my granddad. He's not in the front row of any of those visible ones, but there's a very, very high chance that one of those, unidentifiable men is my grandfather. And then, so he's in for the war's not going to end till November. He's not going to last into November. He's only going to make it to October 1918. So Operation Michael, March 1918, is when the New Zealanders really come into their own. Operation Michael was, in context, America's joined the war by this point, but American troops are taking some time to join in. Meanwhile, the Russians have dropped out. They've been defeated, which has suddenly made enormous numbers of divisions available from the Eastern Front to be brought to the Western Front. The Germans know they've got one last chance if they have any chance of victory. They've got to throw all of those divisions from the Eastern Front against the British lines, smash through, drive the English back to the coast, separate them from the French before enough American numbers can start coming in to tip the balance in the West. That's what Operation Michael is in March 1918. They steamroller in. Ironically, what would have been his brother-in-law is in one of the British battalions who's right in the front line. So my great-uncle, he hasn't got married yet, but what would have been his is a second lieutenant in the London Royal Fusiliers, and his battalion is completely obliterated, overrun. I think a platoon got away, and almost all of them were hospitalised. The rest were killed or captured, so his future brother-in-law was killed in Operation Michael. The New Zealanders had the good fortune, actually. They knew that the war was coming to an end. They had pulled them off the line to train them for open country warfare when all this happened. And so when the Germans steamroller in, there's gaps breaking in the lines left, right, and centre. The New Zealanders are thrown into one of the gaps, which is split wide open. And they actually credit in the official histories, even the German side credits, the New Zealand machine gunners were the ones who blunted the attack. And they said it was unlike anything else they'd seen in World War I. It wasn't trench warfare. They actually found columns of Germans advancing with their backpacks on and all of the rest. Open country warfare, and the New Zealanders were able to plug one of those critical gaps. And then, and also, another American little chapter was a machine gun battalion from Erie, Pennsylvania turned up, and they sent them to join the New Zealand machine gunners to kind of blood them, and they rotated one American company through in the place of a New Zealand company at the time, just to kind of get them used to what it was like on the front line. And then, there's the one who was killed. That's my grandmother, and that's her younger brother who was killed. And then, as we're coming down to the end, the very final chapter of World War I is the 100 Days Offensive. It's basically when they decide the Germans are breaking, we're going to throw everything we have against them, we're going to force them into surrender. We're either going to break through or Now, the Hindenburg Line had been the absolutely impregnable German defences. I mean, this is a diagram here of the kind of stuff the Germans had built. Incredibly deep concrete silos so the Germans could come down here, being completely safe from shell fire, come up to these really strong concrete in place trenches and all of the rest whenever it was time to resist it. And then again, the New Zealanders and the Australians, this is not just me exaggerating because I'm from New Zealand, were generally felt to be one of the better assault forces, tougher troops. And so they were given the job of really assaulting some of the lines. And that brings us to a very fateful day in my family history, not just my family history, but also military history, because October the 8th, 1918, is the day they break the Hindenburg Line. They've been smashing through the trench lines, and this was the last defences. When they break through the Hindenburg Line, the Germans have nothing for about 30 miles. It's the first time they've seen an open country advance. They've been pushed back by the German assault. The Germans have nothing. There's no terrain, there's no canals, there's no trenches. They finally broken the trench lines, open country. The dream that they'd had ever since 1914 of finally breaking the deadlock, that was October the 8th. And that's actually a photo of the area just outside the village of Lisdane. Not a photo, a watercolour painting, and it's dated 2 days after the assault. So it was a New Zealand artist who was there. And what happens is, the New Zealand machine gunners are used as heavy assault troops. You always imagine machine gunners sitting there behind the trenches, fixed positions. We actually got detailed accounts from the unit diaries of machine gunners. They were thrusting them forward, dropping machine gun teams as they went, as heavy support, advancing with the men as they attacked the village. The German counterattack was absolutely obliterated because the machine gunners were all in force. And then, quite fascinating aspects, a couple of German tanks rolled up. Now, they were captured British tanks that had been repurposed. The New Zealanders had nothing that could take out a tank, and just by pure good fortune, a British tank happened to had finished one of its tasks, rolled up on the flank, saw these two German tanks, and just blew them to pieces, rescuing them at the last minute. Now, in all of this whole assault, my granddad is shot through the face. And we don't know exactly what happened, but I think it was something like that. I found this great photo, and it is from the 100-day offensive too. Something ricocheted off the machine. We don't know exactly when on this day, but something happened. And then there's a whole story here. This is in this whole TV series I'm scripting out. Private Ryan starts with the old man going to the cemetery. Have you seen the movie Saving Private Ryan? There's a scene where the old man goes to the cemetery and he's looking at all of these men who died to save them and all the rest. I don't have to make up an opening scene like this, because it's 1960, my mother and my father have just got married, and my father's just taken a job with the Boys Brigade, which is like the Boy Scouts. And there's a man who's been a company captain for many years, and my father doesn't know him, but he's just died, and there's a memorial service. So he's working with it. Of course, he's going to go to the funeral. My grandfather's visiting because he's brought up some wedding presents and things like this. So they all go along to the funeral. They don't know who the guy is. They're just going to the funeral because Dad has to go. Granddad's visiting, so he goes along with them. And as they're sitting in the memorial service, listening to the eulogies and things like this, Granddad says, "I know this guy." He says, "Really? Who is he?" "That's Jimmy Smallbone. He's the guy who saved me in 1918. And Granddad said, Jimmy Smallbone, I mean, what a great, you'd sound like a person who didn't know how to pick good names. Jimmy Smallbone was, Dad said to me one day, do you suppose you could find his military file? It's a pretty rare name. And I did, I found James Thomas Smallbone. And Granddad said, the things that were written down that Granddad had said was, Jimmy Smallbone was a small Cockney guy who jumped ship in New Zealand. He was a kitchen hand. He was always in trouble. He was always nobody thought he'd ever amount to anything. He was a troublemaker. And the fact that he turned around and became this, basically scout pack leader equivalent and, made a big difference to many boys' lives was a surprise to everybody. And when I found his file, I found he was 5'1". He was a Cockney. His former occupation was listed as merchant seaman. So the idea he jumped ship could well be right. And man, he got in trouble all the time. He was always getting fined 3 days' pay, confined to barracks, all sorts. He really was a troublemaker. And best of all, 1 day later, October the 9th, he was promoted to company cook. So this idea that he was a kitchen hand, you don't give a guy like that a medal, but again, I can't help thinking, Why did he get promoted to company cook? It'd be a pay rise. I think that was his reward for rushing out under fire to drag Granddad back to the company aid station. And then the miracle here, he's a contemporary of my parents, and Dad said, I think John Page was in his Boys Brigade company, and I emailed John Page and said, yeah, I think I've got a photo of him at my 21st birthday party. And John Page is shorter than I am. So you can see how small Jimmy Smallbone was. And that photo must have been taken...
He's standing. I thought he was sitting down.
No, they're standing up. And that photo must have been taken less than a year before he died. So I even managed to get a photo of Jimmy Smallbone. And then these photos here. These photos, we had no idea. This is actually how my story of investigating my grandfather's life began. Because about 5 years ago, somebody phoned up my mother and said, have you seen the latest issue of The Listener? The Listener is like a radio, television, Times thing, the kind of magazine you buy to see what's on the TV. That kind of magazine. And Mum didn't subscribe. And she said, no, I don't get The Listener. Well, I think your father's in it. And she went and bought a copy of The Listener. And in The Listener, these 4 photos were there, naming Corporal Robert Bruce Fowler, New Zealand Machine Gun Corps. Because somebody had written a book about New Zealand's World War I photography, and one chapter was about the photos of wounded men from the hospital archives. And out of all of the photos in the book that they could have chosen, they chose these photos to put in a book review for Anzac Day, about 5 years ago. And just what an incredible coincidence. And then we found out, well, where the heck did these photos came from? We got hold of the woman who wrote the book and things like this, and said, oh, well, there's the hospital in England where plastic surgery was developed. Because what happened was, plastic surgery as we know it, if you ever buy a book or see a documentary about the development of plastic surgery, nose jobs, all those kind of things, it all starts at one hospital at Sidcup, Queen Mary's Hospital in Sidcup. Because all the Commonwealth, Australians, New Zealand, Canadians, catastrophic facial wounds, they were all sent to this one hospital. And mostly the surgeons there were dentists, because dentists had experience with, broken jaws and broken teeth and things. And it was there that with so many men going through, that they were able to pioneer plastic surgery. And as a result of that, the records from that one hospital have been preserved. And so when we contacted him, he able to send us these photos. These, you see, 18th of October, these are before surgery photos. And this is 20th of December. He had multiple surgery. They found that it worked better if you did multiple surgeries step by step. They had before and after photos. They sent us, I think, did I send them on the next page? I'm not sure I put them there. Oh, yes, they did. The World War 1918 X-rays of his broken jaw. The doctor's notes about the different things, plus the pencil drawing of what was going on. And a guy had gone through the hospital and he painted about 80 watercolours of wounded soldiers, and he just happened to paint a watercolour of my grandfather. And the archivist has just written a book that is available in our pre-publication. It comes out November this year. It's not out yet, but it's listed on Amazon. They've got the cover. And he actually, because he's been corresponding with us, he asked my mother for permission to use that photo that I showed you on the very first slide, and also a photo of my grandfather as a very old man. And he's going to put a series of before wound, after wound, before surgery, after surgery, and then long-term prognosis. I don't know if he'll use any of the other ones, but so the book's not out yet, but he had to ask permission for use of the images. So Granddad's going to feature in this book that will come out at the end of this year.
Did he have any surgery after that?
Oh, multiple surgery. In fact, 1919, they actually take several of the doctors, lots of the nurses, and a whole bunch of the patients are all put on the same transport ship to go back to New Zealand. And again, Granddad's military file actually has some of the medical board reviews of Granddad. So he can't chew at this point, now he can chew. He's rated as 40% disabled. And then in Dunedin, it's not very much evidence, but he's an outpatient for about a year. And we have all the appointment forms. So at least I know what day he had to go to this jaw hospital for another year while he was in New Zealand. And Granddad said, the doctor said, we could have done a better job. And Granddad just said, enough. I can't go under the knife again.
Oh, yeah.
He just had enough. There's my grandmother. When he had been living in London, he had gone to the same church as her, so he would have known her younger brother who got killed in Operation Michael and others. And he always said he'd come back for her one day. That's probably why he wanted to get back to England. And so he got that wound in October. That last photo of him plastered up was on December 1918. 1st of January 1919, he married my grandmother and returned with her. She was there as well. I found New Zealand newspaper stories noting the arrival of the ship, saying patients and some of their wives. So again, indirectly, I know that's my grandfather and his wife. That's the ship they were on. And in the end, they had my mother's not even born yet. She was a last-minute afterthought. That's all my uncles and things. Notice something interesting about this photo, though. Look at that photo.
You can't tell at all.
The reason you can't tell at all, it's been photoshopped. Long before Photoshop ever. I was looking at that photo. What the heck is wrong with it? And I got a really high-res copy of this photo, and I zoomed in and zoomed in and zoomed in, and only at the maximum zoom you could tell it's not quite right at this part of his face. They've basically done some kind of hand touching up.
Airbrush.
They've airbrushed it, yeah. They did you'd never guess. Absolutely incredible job they did.
Yeah.
And she died in 1960, and I always think this is a good sign for me, strong genes in my family. When he was 70 years old, he married a 40-year-old. So 30 years difference. Apparently, her mother got really annoyed because she thought Granddad was after her. And when she found out that Granddad was actually after her daughter, apparently that bad blood never went away. And eventually, Granddad would pass away in 1986, well, the end.